The tent, the basic building block of refugee camps. It not only highlights the temporariness of a refugee's status, but also symbolizes the right to one day return home. Over the past 77 years, tents morphed into concrete units, suggesting permanent exile. By creating a concrete tent in the Dheisheh refugee camp, our guest today attempted to preserve the archetype for the narration of the Nakba. It is an unusual structure, aesthetic and yet beautiful. At night, pockets of glowing light emanate from it. The concrete tent functions as a communal space for gathering, learning, working, socializing, and hosting cultural activities. Architects Sandi Hilal and Alessandro Petti, both professors of architecture, have been working together for over 2 decades within the framework of DAAR, Decolonizing Architecture and Art Research, with which they have carried out research and architecture projects that are situated between artistic, pedagogical, architectural, and political action. Their artistic research practice, which focuses on justice and equality, has garnered several international awards. This episode was recorded on the 9th of April 2025. I'm your host, Hafaf Shawabibi, and you're listening to Tarwida. Sandi and Alessandro, welcome to Tarwida. Thank you for being with us today. I'd like to ask you first about your personal journeys before we start talking about your incredible work. So maybe each of you can tell me what got you into architecture in the first place, a bit about your journey in that.
Sandi and I met in Venice, where we were studying architecture there. And after finishing our studies, we also both started our PhDs. And I personally entered to Palestine to celebrate basically our wedding. And from that on, I started a journey of discovering, of course, myself, discovering many things that I had to unlearn, being a person that have been educated in Western universities and being grown up in Italy in a simple middle-class family. So I used to say that Palestine was effectively my second PhD, or I would say my real PhD, in which I have learned, or better, unlearned many things.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And Sandi, what about you from your upbringing? What got you into architecture?
Well, I guess I have maybe 2 very important parts of my life that I think they got me in where I am in this moment. Is one maybe that I was a teenager during the first Intifada, and to be part, I have to say, of these schools that have been organized in the neighborhood, and of the lands, the empty lands that were around us, that we began to plant it and to actually take care of our neighborhood in that sense, gave me a sense of understanding education whenever you are in a salon or in a garage of your neighborhood, and knowing that only by being there and studying and learning together with maybe your neighbors because they happen to be teachers is a way of understanding education in a complete different way. And I have to say, I arrived maybe to Italy with that mental set of education is about self-determination, is about understanding who we are, is about reflecting around what we can do of whatever resources we have. But maybe I think the second part that is fundamental in our journey and maybe our practice is to leave to Italy for almost 13 years and returning back actually during my PhD, again, because both me and Alessandro were doing the PhD in the same time. And for me, it was simply a return. So I thought I will be returning back to Bet Sahur, where actually my family is, where I still have the same room that I left, etc., etc. So I felt it was an easy return, right? I mean, it felt like finally I'm returning back home. Finally, things will return to how they were 13 years before. But to discover that I returned back in a complete different set with also, my Italian husband and my Western education and understanding, what is a public space that can contain both of us. So we were learning and unlearning together almost from the terrace of our house. What does it mean, indeed, as architects to return back and to want to work in a place like Palestine?
And I've heard you mention that you had this idea in your head when you were studying abroad that you were going to go back home to Palestine and civilize your community. What changed for you? Where was the point where you realized, no, that's not the right way for you?
I guess what changed was, I went to a Western architectural education. I studied modern architecture. And I have to say that in Western education, and maybe unfortunately in also wherever we are studying, we still did not make any reflection on the relation between modern architecture and colonization. The fact that when I returned back to Palestine and began to think what decolonizing architecture mean, I immediately understood that somehow colonialism came to our countries, not with the idea only of stealing our houses. That was not only the bad face of colonialism, but it came with this idea of modernizing us, of civilizing us, and so it came with a full package of modernity and colonialism together. And indeed, many of us thought that if they would become modern, civilized, and actually almost become Western, then that would be the solution in that sense. And coming back to Palestine and begin to think decolonization, and especially decolonization in disciplines like art and architecture, you would immediately make that link between modern and colonial. And at that point, if you are speaking about decolonization of architecture, you cannot avoid thinking, what did it meant for me to go to think that I'm studying modern architecture in order to return back to civilize or to make modern Palestine? And if that is not the task, because you understand that connection between modernity and colonization, then what is our task? And I think our journey was all about what is that task that we are talking about, thinking about decolonizing art and architecture. And indeed, actually decolonizing also our own life practices. It does not only actually go into art and architecture, but into what daily life practices we can understand by returning back to our roots, not only as indigenous embroidery and debka, but to return back to live our normal life, delinking and maybe rethinking that the salvation would come out of us becoming modern, civilized communities.
I've heard Alessandro mention that as an Italian, decolonization meant is more in the context of Europe and modernity. Alessandro, was it when you met Sandi and came to Palestine the first time and started becoming familiar with everything there? Is that when your notion of decolonization shifted?
I guess it's been a journey. First of all, when we were living in Palestine, decolonizations meant essentially fighting against Israel colonizations, apartheid, and occupations. That was simply somehow the reference. The question of what does it mean to decolonize shifted in the moment also that we had to leave Palestine, and our body were then in a different locations, in one of the periphery of Europe. So in that sense, then the question of what does it mean to decolonize shifted in a sense that was not that we suddenly became uninterested or on continuing the struggle on Palestine, but was rather to find a ground from which we can still work on decolonization of Palestine. And being in Europe, what does it mean to decolonize was, in that sense, first, importantly, not only recognizing, of course, the century colonial history of Europe, but more specifically also undermining the idea of modernity as a kind of progressive, emancipatory project. And that's why, by being in Europe, we started also to maybe build a sort of different vocabulary and understanding how also our actions could be still part of the bigger struggle of decolonization of Palestine. But from European perspective, we also thought that the task of us living in this period in Europe was also demodernizations. And by that, we mean not abandoning, the technology or the kind of things that we use every day, but abandoning the idea of the promise that comes with the idea of modernization, and especially, of course, has been deployed, outside of Europe, and in this specific case, also what using the word of Walter Mignolo is what actually modernity is hiding is, in fact, colonization. And therefore, for me, also teaching at university became a very important place from which demodernization means, of course, undermining, for example, the idea of this linear history, in which Europe, think himself as a civilization that starts from the Greek and the Roman and has this kind of epic time, during the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, and then modernizations come, The idea is also that the task for some of us that are in Europe is not only being solidarity with people that still live under colonizations, direct colonization, but is also undermining, this singular, individual, heroic, trajectory that also depicts Europe as a sort of, as I said, sort of history that goes in this sort of linear way. So in this case, for me, let's say the move then between Palestine and then Europe was also trying to understand what was the task in this bigger struggle of decolonization, that I could still feel that I'm, part of this bigger struggle.
Tell us about your work. How would you describe it to the average person who isn't familiar with it?
I would say that our work is, first of all, maybe undisciplined in a sense that is programmatically happening in the crack between things, in the cracks between architecture, art, and politics. So we have been trained as architects. However, we haven't find interesting to operate only into the architecture world, and especially the commercial world. So in that sense, architecture has been always for us a kind of way of understanding our reality, but at the same time, when actually we did design buildings, and sometimes, of course, we realize some of them, but architecture was always for us something that needed to be connected with social issues, with political dimensions, with its ideological apparatus. So was never enough for us, just being an architect. Then the other, let's say, territories that we are also occupying and using is the arts. And the arts, we come to the art more because some of the things that we wanted to do could not exist in reality. They were somehow part of the art world, were somehow part of the possibility for art to be free, independent, to explore ideas that, in a way, for example, in architecture would be impossible to explore. So specifically, art exhibitions become somehow a place, in which we can actually exercise that.
You mean like
and the other
you mean like certain creative ideas or projects that are difficult to implement in reality?
Correct. One example being, for example, this was the moment in which there was the withdrawal of Israeli army from Gaza, and there was discussions about how to reuse the settlements that were there, and this draws a series of projects, architectural projects that we started to imagine, where we were thinking how to reuse Israeli settlements after their evacuations. And of course, with the reality that we know, which is actually an ongoing accelerated colonization, this seems like an impossibility into the present. But nevertheless, for us, was very important actually to imagine that, because this was somehow a way to not accepting the injustice of the present and imagining how one day these settlements will be evacuated, and therefore these questions, is relevant. And for us become relevant not only, in the future, but is relevant in the present, because one of the things that colonization does is not only the occupation of space, and destruction and killing of people, but also for the ones that are still alive is also the occupation of the mind, which is the worst of colonization, is the fact that somehow you are prevented from thinking a different reality from the colonial reality that is imposed on you. So for us, in a sense, we mobilize art and architecture in order to imagine, a different future, but lived into the present. And that's why then exhibitions become, if you like, this spatial experiences that people will do visiting a space and imagining something that at the present is politically impossible, but is through an exhibitions becomes something that you can experience.
That's really interesting. I think it's very important to imagine what seems impossible. I think it's important to plant that idea in people's minds. But let's turn now to the work that you were able to materialize, let's say, and your biggest focuses are the refugee camps. So when your first daughter was born, you decided to move to Palestine, and where you could be part of a collective community. Tell us about what your experience was and the start of the Campus and Camps project, what the idea behind it is.
So in that sense, we returned back when Tala was born because we were really threatened of being, me and Alessandro, raising a daughter, and we wanted her really to be raised and loved by an extended family. It felt like one of us will still be behind if we are living in Europe, while if you are living in Beit Sahur, we will be helped and supported by the rest of the family in order to actually both raise our daughter and in some way work. And maybe to return back also a little bit before Campus and Camps, so for people to understand that, our maybe, I don't know if to call it career, work, whatever you want to call it, it is not something that we do because we have to work. When people say, what is your work? It's so hard for me to answer what is your work. Ask me, what is my life look like? Because all comes together in so many ways, right? So that is also a very important distinction for the ones that are hearing us. Is in that sense, our work indeed departure from our own house, and we call it DAAR. And in somehow DAAR in Arabic means home, right? So in that sense, it is a way of understanding how we departure from certain questions that are important for us. But then when Tala born, actually, I still remember she was still 10 days when I was offered a work in UNRWA. And that was, for me, also a bit of a shifting while we were really establishing our artistic practice. I myself was almost a technocrat inside UNRWA because, there was this whole moment of recreating an idea of improving the life in refugee camps does not jeopardize the right of return, and therefore they created a program called Infrastructure and Camp Improvement Program. And they asked me to do research, and then later on I began to work in the department to think actually what does it mean for us to rethink refugee camp and how actually in some way we would understand camps. And strangely enough, both of us actually have finished their PhDs. And when we arrive to camps, we realize that all the knowledge we are carrying are not useful to understand what was happening inside the camp, because it was clear working inside UNRWA was the first thing that the legal office would continuously still telling me always to keep in mind is that UNRWA does not manage refugee camps, but they provide services. Not being manager means that there is no one managing the public space, but the people themselves. And in the camp, people are building their own houses without even owning them, but they consider them their own house. So if we will apply these categories of private, public, green, the ones that we learn to do in architecture, the first exercise they give you to do in architecture is to draw the colors of private, public, green, this and that. And then you arrive and says there is no drawing of colors in camps, but we don't have a vocabulary. So maybe the creation of a university inside a refugee camp, we really felt that we need to recreate a university in a refugee camp. We call it campus in camps because we thought that we should bring the campus, the university campus in the camp as a way to begin to understand what we have in front of our eyes and to rethink the words we are using, to rethink the concepts, to rethink the camp from a completely different way, not as a periphery of the city, but as the center of understanding Palestine. Because in some way, if we do not understand exile as Palestinians, we will never return back home. We will never understand what home is for us, because home is not anymore in the 47. Home has been part of our exile. Our heritage is that exile. And if we do not include that in our history, we will never be able to return back home. So for us, the right of return was about understanding how you include the camp and the exile and the Palestinian exile in the narration. And we really needed a university together with other people from the camp to think together, what does that mean?
So what initiatives are important to highlight once you set up campus and camps?
First of all, it was important to acknowledge what is a camp also for the people that were involved, because the rhetoric that the camp is only the place of marginalization and suffering, in a way, was also so much imposed by media representations, and political discourse. So one of the first very important thing, it was to give value to things that the community of refugees built despite the suffering, despite the violence that is continued to be, exercised by Israel colonization. And that was also done by trying also to build a specific concept and vocabularies. And that's why, for example, we had to reactivate the word of al-masha as a kind of word that can express the sense of communality that exists in the camp, and giving value to that. And that, emerged of several initiatives, from this base. We personally started a project that we call the Refugee Heritage, that in a way started more also as a provocation, if you like, at the very beginning, by thinking, could a refugee camp can be enlisted in the UNESCO World Heritage List?
And that's Dheisheh, right? Refugee camp?
Specifically, yes. Specifically was Dheisheh, because that is the place that we were more invested in, where also we built another project, which is the concrete tent. But the base of all of that for us was really this very long-term research project that led, into this refugee heritage that evolved. The first 2 years was very much a discussion with the people who were participating in campus in camps and the people in Dheisheh, because of course, these were very difficult questions, asking people living in a camp, do refugee camp have history, means also recognize, this history of exile that always has been dismissed by everyone, including the community itself, on the idea that, that is a history that doesn't have any value, and this has been moved, into several dimensions, being also really a nomination dossier, in which there is a collections of photographs, but also documentations, where we were arguing that the history of refugee camp is so important, that needs to be recognized. And importantly, in this case, also led us to say that was not only, in this case, the refugee camp itself, but also, of course, the 44 villages that have been destroyed in 1948, because the camp can only exist because, in a way, it's connected to these 44 villages of origin. And all of this has been an incredible process of learning and unlearning, that took years. And in fact, to really recognize the legacy of refugee camps being not only a place of violence and poverty, but also being the place of resistance. So for us was in that moment also recognizing, and imagining also how a return, a political return can happen only when we recognize that history, that we are not just erasing also what people built on over 70 years of exile, despite, of course, colonization and despite marginalization.
And so you mentioned the concrete tent, which was first in Dheisheh, but then since then, you've done it in Abu Dhabi, Rabat, and Sharjah. Tell us about the concrete tent.
So the concrete tent was actually that attempt of being architect, I have to say, because after a few years of campus in camps, we were indeed walking, talking and understanding and reflecting, using mainly words and vocabulary and philosophy and political theory, etc., etc. Some of the people in the camp almost challenge us to say, but where is architecture? How can we somehow talk to all what we were speaking about? And of course, there is a moment where we were understanding that this life of permanent temporariness, that, in some way, refugees were living that temporariness. They were struggling and fighting through that temporariness in order not to normalize their own life. That life of permanent temporariness is extremely important to understand, to look at, to understand both philosophically and architecturally and in all senses. And when you actually, anyone, even sometimes among Palestinian kids that have not been in refugee camps, when you say refugee camp, they would imagine tents. They would imagine places that are not really built in concrete, like what they are normally, refugee camps in Palestine and elsewhere in the Middle East, that they are really built of 7 and 8 floor of concrete. And in that sense, we really wanted to have that sort of tension. And therefore, when we really built the concrete tent, it was a way to make the simple question arriving to the Dheisheh refugee camp, why a concrete tent? And in that sense, what is a life and a permanent temporariness? And indeed, actually, we built it in a moment where we were doing campus in camps or a little bit after, and we were wondering if we have to build a university in a refugee camp, how this university would look like if we were commissioned as architects to build a university in a refugee camp. And the classroom for us was the real classrooms that would contain these discussions were simply a concrete tent. And then that concrete tent surprises us each time it moves from one place to another, because it also speaks to a different permanent temporariness. We did the concrete tent in the campus of NYU Abu Dhabi, and it was so speaking to so many people in the Emirates that are there, and they know that they will not be permanent in that place, but they are actually living in a temporary way, even if they have works and they gain money and they have a very good situation, they still think, should I invest in buying a house or I am leaving anyway in 5 years? And so that kind of permanent temporariness brings with it a discussion around what does it mean and how there are now in our worlds a lot of people that is asking that question, should I buy a sofa or I am maybe moving in a year, so it's better I wait. And we are so many people that actually struggling with notions of belonging, of where home is, what we do. And it was really beautiful to see how many professors from the NYU Abu Dhabi campus was saying that they were really taking their students and have the class a lot of time when needed in the concrete end, because it will immediately even shift the relation between students and teacher, the relation between permanent and temporariness, the relation between in and out, the relation between a classroom and not a classroom. So in somehow each time it moves, and wherever it stays, it interacts with that environment and it creates different questions and different dynamics.
Did the ones that are outside of Palestine, did they stay? Or like, is the concrete tent still there in Abu Dhabi and in Sharjah?
Well, Abu Dhabi, actually, they had to remove it. But the one in Sharjah seems to be actually still standing. And the one in Sharjah was really built in a moment where we were witnessing the genocide in Gaza. And we had that moment where whenever you have a strike or whenever you have people that are killed by the Israeli occupation or anything else, people will put tents and they create funerals, they create public mournings, they create public strikes. And we thought, why not the concrete tent to become a space for public mourning? And it really was incredible to see how many people needed a space to actually be in a collective mourning instead of their screens looking only at what was happening, and the fact that they were crying in a collectivity, the fact that there was a moment where actually we were remembering all the names of what we call the incomplete list of children that were killed in Gaza. So in some way, also in that moment, the concrete tent in Sharjah worked as a moment of public mourning, and it feels that it stays in the heart of so many people that they are thinking about, is it possible? What does it mean to keep it? But our projects actually have that also hybridity of being always permanent temporariness project, because they are always built as temporary projects and meant to be temporary, and in that sense almost meant to be even eaten by the sand in Sharjah. And yet sometimes that temporariness might go longer.
Another project of yours was in Gaza, which was the Al-Nada neighborhood reconstruction, which also now has been completely destroyed. Can you tell us about the work that you did there?
Right. The project of Al-Nada emerged in collaboration with another studios and friends that we work with through commissions from the Italian corporations to rebuild what was destroyed already by a President Israeli invasions, to rebuild 300 units in the north of Gaza. Al-Nada was very close to the border. And that's why also is one of the reasons that's been one of the very first places that's been completely destroyed by the latest Israeli aggressions. At that time, people were also asking, would this architecture will prevent or will protect us for another Israeli attack? Already at that time, we knew that architecture cannot actually protect people from one of the endless Israeli invasions. Because maybe it might be good to remember that taking only as an example the people that were re-inhabiting Al-Nada social housing project were people that have been already displaced several times. The whole project rotates around the possibility of building communal spaces, but also challenging how usually the reconstruction is actually very bureaucratically understood, where people are treated simply as numbers. And that might be also be a lesson, to enter into this very violent, surreal discussions about, also reconstruction in Gaza and what all the challenges, that this will bring. In our specific case, there were several things, that we tried to avoid or try to obtain. So one was that people could maintain the social tissues that they had before. One of the problems of reconstructions that one could almost argue that sometimes reconstruction can be even more violent than destruction itself. And the way he does it is that simply if any project of reconstruction, it does not recognize the existence, it does not recognize the social connections that existed before, basically the reconstruction is another ways on which somehow artificially bring people together, in a way also negating what were actually the very base of the social connections. This also explains why the Israeli invasions are so violently also against architecture and the space itself. In fact, Sari Hanafi coined, this term of spatiocide in a way, because also is the very existence of any Palestinian space that is something that Israeli cannot tolerate. Any idea of a collectivity that it then can become potentially a community and therefore a political community that claims rights, including, of course, the right to exist on the land of Palestine, and specifically in this case also, of course, the right of return, is understood as a threat, as an existential threat constantly. And that maybe can partially explain the madness of this, war that in the last 10, 15 years were happening, in a kind of cycles, and the last one, of course, we call it war, but of course we know that it's not a war because it's specifically a targeting of killing any possibility of inhabitations. At the same time, one way also not to, as we were saying from the beginning, not to lose hope, because that's what is, let's say, colonization wants, that you just become subjugated to that reality. We also have incredible, powerful story of, for example, people returning. We saw that, just a few months ago when people were able to return to their homes that in fact are not homes, but is rubble, and they were somehow incredibly re-inhabiting even the rubble itself, showing the world, that Palestinians are not going anywhere. So in one way, we also want to acknowledge this very inspirational moments that when they do happen, they also shows, possibility of returns. And for us, that specific returns was also open up, to our political imagination of the possibility of the Palestinians' returns, even, of course, to their places of origin, because many times people, forget that 80% of the populations in Gaza are refugees, and most of them are refugees from villages that were just few kilometers away. And I have to say that one of the other inspiring thing that we witnessed was also that despite this incredible, unprecedented violence on Palestinian life and the very social tissues of Palestinian life, one thing that until now that we're unable to break down, it was this sort of social connections. In a sense, we also want to look at how, despite all, let's say, the violence exercised on Palestinian life, people manage to survive. And of course, it's very hard from today, from where we speak, to really understand or trying even to imagine, how the day after will look like. The important thing is, of course, is the same things that people were telling us, how we prevent a new destructions, if we ever manage to rebuild this place.
Yeah, certainly. It's very hard to think about reconstruction right now. Recently on the Rethinking Palestine podcast, Abdurrahman Kattana, who's a Palestinian architect and researcher, said regardless of what plan is adopted, it needs to work within a framework by locals, by the Palestinians themselves. He mentioned the Gaza Faniq framework because, like you said, you can't rebuild just in isolation. It has to be based on the society, on the community. But God knows where this is gonna, how this is gonna materialize. So just shifting to one of the projects that you're focusing on now, or let's say shifting to one of the themes you're focusing on now, which is the student encampments and how they're connected to the camps, the refugee camps. So you're offering a course on decolonizing architecture with a focus on the student encampments. Tell us about that.
I guess with the present so much filled with violence, that is also sometimes paralyzes people and makes people to feel completely vulnerable and exposed, to this completely unrestricted violence. We had very few moments, in which we saw the possibility of emerging of different political communities, alliances that were not there before. Among them, I have to say that we have been traveling, doing lectures in several universities, and we met these incredible groups of very young, motivated people that was absolutely inspiring, in a landscape made by older generations that are complicit to what is happening, and to see these generations that just maybe were defined, as the, just always in front of the screen, apolitical, they are not engaged in anything. I also remember my colleagues at university, complaining about the fact how this new generations is not engaged. And the moment they become engaged, they call the police. I mean, I have to say, I still feel so ashamed, overwhelmed. I'm not sure even, what kind of words I can use, in which we witness students moved by sentiment of justice, moved by, wanting to stop a war, wanting to stop a genocide, wanting, to stop occupations, colonizations, values that these liberal colleges were, building up in their curriculums. And in the moment, these very values are actually put into practice, the same institutions there to call the police and literally beat them. I really feel so ashamed, to belong to a category of people that somehow agreed or simply, was not acting. Luckily, I have to say there are few of us that try to do something, but otherwise, I would say the vast majority, in a way, are still thinking that they can teach in universities that now are places that have been somehow object of such huge repressions that also in this case, as we speak, is actually escalating. And in our convictions to remain optimist, so that somehow we see that violence unfolding, but also knowing that maybe these encampments were really pointing out to, first of all, the end of this ideology of this suprematist Western culture and educations. I guess that was maybe the very last moment in which many people outside of the West, they already knew. But now, it's very clear that all of these talks, on human rights and justice, and these are just empty when applied, to certain bodies and certain people. And I guess this global consciousness is the capital on which we have to build, the platform for the future. Because in a way, I saw how these generations were able to connect their struggle in the place where they live. That could be, for example, environmental struggles, or gender, or different kind of struggles that somehow start to be connected one to each other. No, instead of competing and saying that is more important than the other, Palestine became somehow a sort of the center of a series of things that people were finally able to connect. And this seems to me a much more long-term ways of understanding that Palestine can only be freed also if this parallel struggle also find ground in different places. So that is something that the next year we'll try to reflect on. On one side, understanding, of course, how that was a form of repression, but also how with encampments that also have this incredible similarities of with camps, with refugee camps where we talked about. On one side it seems like very different, but on the other side, if we think carefully, both of them, of course, they origin from the idea of a camp being a space carved out from state sovereignty. Both of them are somehow one. The refugee camp is a space that somehow has been created after a political crisis, a humanitarian crisis, and in a way, it's a manifestation of this political crisis. On the other side, in a similar way, even though from different directions, if you like, it's also a manifestation of a political crisis. A camp, in fact, is set up, as a protest, also as a place, which is temporary and fragile and made of different kind of materials and people, because in a way, the presence look like that collapse. The political organization of the present look like, not being able to work anymore, and therefore the encampment is this. Architecture, I will argue, is also the place in which, everything is reconstructed by the inhabitant of the place, taking back their agency to rebuild things as they want. And it's beautiful to see how these encampments, if you like, they are also suggesting how, reconstructions maybe can happen, can suggest also ways in which we can reimagine how people regain the agency, of how to rebuild their own spaces. Because this agency has been completely taken away by big corporations, big public projects, where people are only look at, users. They are not actually part of the process of actually actively building their spaces.
That's very interesting. Just in coming towards the end of our conversation, what is your vision for DAAR in the coming years?
A hard question. I think in some way we have been moving in different tasks. If I would have looked back in order to understand how to look to the future, if at the beginning it was very much about what does it mean for us to rethink our disciplines, what does it mean for us actually to create cracks in the system in order for us to exist differently and open these spaces for other people to exist together with us. I think Gaza is showing all of us that it is not enough only to protest. That will make us feel completely powerless. And one of the things that we are seeing, that there are a lot of younger generation of architects and artists that with whom we are working, scholars, that are willing to understand how, as a response to a genocide, in a moment of powerlessness, right? In a moment of not being able to do anything, how you will turn your own sort of discipline, university, architecture, art, exhibitions, and many other things, but even holding a shop or doing anything, it's from there that we have to crack the system, thinking that we crack that darkness we are in only by bunching the system back. I think we are only feeding in that system. Well, I think we have a very long sort of trajectory experience into understanding how to live within the ruins of certain things, because we knew, architecture is a very conservative sort of discipline. It's, architects built for the power most of the time. And we decided as DAAR, instead of building for the power, what if we will use the same skills in order to reverse it against itself? I have to say one of our major practices is whenever we find ourselves doing a project, even the refugee heritage, for example, is a project where we take the UNESCO as a very colonial sort of structure and try to turn the table against it and says, what if we will recognize exile, refugee camps, and the right of return as part of that colonial structure, right? So I think we have been always turning the table, and we are in front of this moment of darkness. I think we find that there are a lot of people that are approaching us, and where we are in communities, that they understand that the only way for us to continue acting today and not only being powerless is through shifting the power structure, not in terms of only confronting it, but in terms of maybe I would say re-existing in certain spaces on our own terms. And actually, if we would take that back to Gaza and understand how we will think reconstruction, repair, rebuilding of Gaza as a way of rethinking the right of self-determination, because through the construction of our own houses, we can still be acting upon our right to rethink our houses, to rebuild our houses. And instead of only thinking about it as, a way of only rebuilding what was destroyed, if we will turn the table again and says, how can we rethink Gaza and departure from Gaza and exactly of the heritage of the genocide? We wrote a book called Architecture After Revolution, and it was a moment maybe where we were inspired by the Arab Spring. And I think now we are in front of architecture after genocide. And architecture after genocide cannot but thinking the right of self-determination as a way of thinking the right of self-construction of a place that remains yours. And if we failed as architects, as Palestinians, as community that are friends with Palestinians, to understand reconstruction in Gaza as a way of rebuilding and re-understanding our right to self-determination, I think we will collapse again into this whole construction, reconstruction, endless erasing of our own selves and histories.
That's a very strong point to end on, and to get everyone thinking and rethinking. Thank you for sharing your very unique approach to work and life, and enlightening us with your ideas and visions on how to turn things around and rethink what is, we always assume that what's given to us or what's in power or the way that things are set, this is how things are. But, it's people like you who come and challenge, and hopefully will make a big difference in the many years to come. So thank you so much for your time, Sandi and Alessandro. Very
Thank
nice
you.
to speak to you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to Tarwida, a podcast dedicated to bringing you the best of Palestinian arts and culture. For more information, please follow us on social media, and don't forget to subscribe. Salam.